December 5th, 1960. The morning air in Detroit bit harder than the calendar suggested, carrying a silence that felt unnatural for a city used to constant motion. A patrolman on his routine route stumbled upon a scene that would haunt him forever. A maroon Ford Fairlane, abandoned and cold, parked beneath the skeletal arms of leafless oak trees. Its doors were unlocked, the interior neat, untouched, as if nothing had gone wrong, but the absence of one person screamed louder than any cry. A single glove, pearl-buttoned and delicate, rested on the passenger floor mat. That glove belonged to Kathy Collins. One small, ordinary item, yet it screamed that someone had been torn from her life without warning, leaving only a fragment of existence behind. Her car, usually a symbol of independence and routine, had become a mute witness to an unspeakable violation. Officers and neighbors who arrived on the scene felt a weight in the air, an anger that surged from the injustice itself. How could someone take a life so full of promise, so intertwined with a city that thrived on its people? How could a woman known for her warmth, her laughter, her plans for the future simply vanish? Frustration gnawed at everyone involved, from the officers questioning every detail to the colleagues who had laughed with her just days before. For Stanley Monroe, her fiancé, the sight was unbearable. His hands trembled as he examined the car, a sense of helpless fury coursing through him. Every unanswered question ignited a storm of rage and heartbreak. Why Kathy? Why now? Why anyone? And as the first snow of December clung to the asphalt, it seemed to mock the absence of justice, cold and unyielding. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. December 3rd, 1960 began like any other for Kathy Collins, but it would end in a nightmare that Detroit would not forget for decades. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, streetcars clanging, shopkeepers calling out, children scurrying to school. But Kathy's life that day was threaded with quiet purpose. She woke early in her tidy Rosedale Park apartment, the sunlight cutting across her small kitchen table, sipping coffee as she prepared for work at Hudson's, the department store where she was more than just an employee. She was a presence, a bright spark in the bustling world of commerce and fashion. Her fiancé, Stanley, waved goodbye with a reassuring smile, unaware that the day's ordinary routines would soon unravel into tragedy. Kathy met her best friend, Lainey Hayes, in the late afternoon, both of them laughing over plans for dinner and a movie. There was warmth in the air, a sense of belonging and security. Yet an invisible tension lingered just enough to make every small choice feel heavier in retrospect. The two women set out for the evening, their conversation filled with jokes, dreams, and fleeting glimpses of future ambitions. But the city that embraced them also concealed dangers. The streets, though familiar, could transform in an instant. 5 minutes passed. 10. 20. Lainey's unease grew, small tremors of worry curling into anxiety. Kathy, usually punctual to the minute, had not arrived. The first signs of alarm rippled through the evening. A knock on the apartment door that went unanswered. Lights that remained dark. A silence that screamed. Each unanswered ring and unlit window sent a fresh surge of dread racing through Lainey's chest. Stanley's fear was immediate, sharp, and consuming. The man who had planned a future with Kathy found himself thrust into uncertainty and despair. Flyers were drawn, his own hands shaking as he pasted Kathy's smiling face across the neighborhood, a symbol of hope now mingled with desperation. Every passerby who looked at her photo became a silent witness to the anguish of someone who could not understand how a life so vibrant could vanish overnight. The city watched, and in watching, it held its breath. Mothers clutched their children closer. Neighbors whispered warnings and speculations. Even the brightest streets of Detroit seemed to dim under the weight of a woman's absence. A life interrupted so violently that it forced every resident to question the safety they had always taken for granted. The ordinary evening had become a crucible of fear and helplessness, a testament to the fragile line between daily routine and unthinkable loss. Every moment of that day mattered. Every choice, every street taken or not taken loomed large in the minds of those who would later retrace her steps. Kathy Collins's final day alive became more than a timeline. It became a measure of collective anxiety, a canvas painted with worry, rage, and heartbreak. The questions multiplied faster than answers could arrive. Who could have done this? Why would anyone target someone like Kathy? And perhaps most pressing of all, would she ever be found? By the early hours of December 4th, Detroit was stirring to a news that sent shivers through its streets. Kathy Collins was missing. The frantic buzz of the city shifted. What had been ordinary chatter turned to whispers of worry and disbelief. Her fiancé, Stanley Monroe, and best friend Lainey Hayes became engines of desperation, driven by a helpless rage that propelled them from street to street, apartment to apartment, knocking on doors and calling out names, their voices raw with fear. Neighbors watched from windows, sensing the urgency, but powerless to intervene. Flyers, hastily drawn yet earnest, began appearing on lampposts, store windows, and bus stops. Kathy's smiling face, once a symbol of her cheerful, bright life, now became a stark emblem of alarm, a life suspended in uncertainty. The city itself seemed to lean in, aware that one of its own had vanished, and no one knew where or how. Every sound, the wind rustling through barren trees, distant car horns, footsteps on icy sidewalks, felt like a clue or a threat. Police, initially hesitant, were finally pressed into action. Detective Howard "Howie" Becket arrived at Kathy's apartment, his mind already racing through possibilities. He examined the abandoned Fairlane, noting details that others might overlook. The unlocked doors, the absence of the keys, the lone glove that spoke of a sudden interruption in Kathy's life. Every question he asked, every lead he pursued, seemed to collide with the same chilling reality. There was no struggle, no immediate indication of violence, only the stark absence of a young woman with a full life ahead of her. Stanley's grief became a public, painful display of human vulnerability. His hands trembled as he coordinated search parties, his anger mingling with the agony of not knowing. Friends, co-workers, and volunteers scoured alleys, vacant lots, and the edges of Rouge Park, their lanterns piercing the dark with intermittent light, a testament to the relentless determination born of love and despair. Every frozen puddle, every snow-laden shrub became a potential hiding place or a grim reminder of what might have been. The media caught wind of the story, and Detroit's residents were riveted. Radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines amplified the tension, their words acting as both alarm and conduit for communal grief. Mothers tightened their children's coats, husbands held wives closer, and the streets echoed with a collective fear that something precious had been stolen without explanation. Despite hours of searching, every lead dissolved into frustration. Lainey retraced their evening plans, replaying conversations, noting every pause and glance, hoping to uncover a clue missed in the first frantic hours. Stanley drove endlessly through neighborhoods, past businesses and parks, each turn of the wheel punctuated by mounting dread and the gnawing, furious question: who could commit such a cruel act, and why? The city, normally resilient and proud, felt smaller, confined, vulnerable. In that growing panic, anger and heartbreak intertwined. Anger at an unknown perpetrator, at the system that initially delayed the search, and at fate itself for putting a life so bright into sudden darkness. Kathy Collins's disappearance was no longer just a personal loss. It was a wound cutting across the community, a visceral reminder of how fragile safety truly was. By nightfall, the search continued. The streets quieter, but the tension thicker. Every shadow seemed longer, every step heavier. Detroit was holding its breath, caught between hope and despair, and for those closest to Kathy, the hours stretched into an unbearable eternity. The city's brightest lights were dimmed, not by snow or winter, but by a pain that refused to be ignored. The Fairlane sat frozen under the skeletal oaks, a silent marker of a life abruptly interrupted. The single glove on the floor mat had not moved since the patrolman first discovered it, yet it seemed to pulse with the unanswered questions of the city. Detective Howard Becket arrived just as the morning fog began to lift, the chill pressing against his coat. Every detail demanded scrutiny: the unlocked doors, the absence of the keys, the untouched interior, but it was the glove that held his attention. The last fragment of Kathy Collins's presence, a tangible remnant of a life stolen in the span of moments. Beckett's eyes swept the area, cataloging the scene with a sharp, disciplined gaze. He noted the lack of any signs of struggle, the clean arrangement of the interior, and the way the snow-dusted ground around the car bore no footprints except for those of the patrolman. Each observation forced a pressing question. Had Kathy entered the car willingly, or had someone persuaded her with a practiced ease that left no trace? The unanswered question gnawed at him, an invisible pressure that only sharpened his focus. Back at headquarters, the case was met with cautious urgency. Some officers assumed a voluntary disappearance. Others whispered theories that could not yet be confirmed. Becket, however, refused to indulge in assumptions. He began outlining his plan. Interview friends, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who could shed light on her final hours. The city, usually impatient with delays, seemed to hold its breath as the first threads of an investigation were woven. Tension building not from violence at that moment, but from absence, uncertainty, and the relentless ache of unanswered questions. Every citizen who heard of Kathy's disappearance felt the weight of the unknown pressing into the familiar rhythm of Detroit life. And for Detective Becket, each passing hour without an answer was a reminder. The clock was moving, but justice had yet to start its journey. Detective Howard Becket's reputation for tenacity was well known in the department, but even he understood the delicate balance between diligence and frustration in a case like Kathy Collins's. From the moment he examined the abandoned Fairlane, he sensed the complexity hidden within its quiet stillness. The absence of struggle, the lone glove, the neat interior, all of it pointed to a perpetrator who relied on subtlety rather than force. Someone who understood how to exploit trust. Becket began the painstaking process of interviewing those closest to Kathy. Each conversation was a delicate negotiation between facts and emotion, and each witness carried their own weight of worry, fear, or guilt. Friends recounted minor, seemingly trivial details. Laughs shared over coffee. Fleeting interactions in the store. But Becket knew the smallest observation could become the key to unlocking the truth. The detective's method was precise. He documented timelines, cross-checked alibis, and mapped every interaction. Yet, frustration built quickly. Leads that seemed promising dissolved under scrutiny, and each dead end only heightened the emotional strain. For Becket, this was not just a case file. It was a human story of loss and vulnerability. The young woman who had vanished had become a symbol of the fragility of everyday life, and her absence reverberated through every corner of Detroit. As night fell, the city's hum felt muted, as if it, too, recognized the gravity of the mystery. Becket worked tirelessly, eyes scanning the evidence for patterns others might miss, intuition guiding him where logic faltered. He understood that every detail, no matter how insignificant it appeared, demanded attention. The emotional weight of the missing woman pressed on him, blending anger, empathy, and an unwavering determination to restore order to a life disrupted by inexplicable cruelty. In those long hours, the city waited alongside him, its collective fear and curiosity, a quiet drumbeat urging the investigation forward, even as answers remained frustratingly out of reach. Officer Reginald "Reggie" Davies had walked the streets of Detroit for years, but nothing prepared him for the weight of Kathy Collins's disappearance. His knowledge of the neighborhoods, the shortcuts, and the quiet corners of the city suddenly took on urgent significance. The abandoned Fairlane was more than a car. It was a signal that danger had pierced the rhythm of ordinary life. Reggie knew every block, every tree-lined avenue near Rouge Park, and he spent hours retracing footsteps, seeking the faintest sign of disturbance. The community responded with a mix of fear, anger, and determination. Neighbors joined search parties, their movements frantic yet purposeful, fueled by the emotional intensity of the unknown. Mothers clutched children tightly as they walked past the area, Shopkeepers paused in doorways, watching every passerby. Each whispered theory, every rumor, inflamed tension and sparked debate. Had Kathy vanished willingly, or had something unimaginable occurred? Reggie became the bridge between police and public anxiety, listening to the stories of frightened citizens, noting details that others might dismiss. He absorbed the collective frustration, anger, and sorrow, knowing these emotions were not just background noise, they were critical clues to understanding the city's pulse. Witness accounts were contradictory at times, and the lines between rumor and observation blurred, creating challenges that demanded patience, discernment, and empathy. The officer's presence reassured some, yet heightened dread for others. People wanted answers but feared what those answers might reveal. Every conversation, every piece of information, carried emotional weight. For Reggie, it was not simply about collecting facts, but navigating the raw humanity that surged through the community. In the midst of the uncertainty, one truth remained. Kathy Collins's disappearance had exposed the fragile line between safety and vulnerability, and Officer Davies, with his experience and steady resolve, was determined to confront that reality. Even as the city wrestled with questions that had no immediate answers, days turned into a blur of interviews, tips, and dead ends. Every promising lead seemed to dissolve the moment it was pursued, leaving a bitter taste of frustration for both detectives and the community. Friends and co-workers were questioned repeatedly, their statements carefully logged, yet nothing pointed to a clear suspect. Every detail, once hopeful, became a reminder of how fragile progress could be. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear and speculation. Some suggested Kathy had run away, a thought that angered Stanley Monroe beyond measure. Others whispered about strangers seen near her apartment or in the shopping district, theories that could not be verified. Each new tip pulled the investigators in a different direction, only to reveal nothing substantial. The emotional toll mounted, particularly for those closest to Kathy, whose hope oscillated between optimism and despair. Detective Becket and Officer Davies faced the heavy weight of community expectation. Residents demanded answers, and every day without resolution intensified scrutiny. The emotional engagement was palpable, not in words, but in the relentless pressure that hung over the department. Every false lead was a reminder of the injustice suffered by Kathy and the helplessness felt by those searching for her. Even with evidence like the pearl-buttoned glove, the investigation seemed to stall. The car's clean interior and the lack of signs of struggle suggested a calculated act, yet no pattern emerged from the interviews or observations. Each misstep, each dead end, strengthened the mystery and intensified the frustration of a city that refused to forget a young woman who had vanished without a trace. Through it all, one sentiment persisted. Kathy Collins's absence was not simply a missing person case. It was a wound felt across Detroit, a story of anger, grief, and relentless questioning that would echo for decades. Every lead, though fruitless, only deepened the need for resolution. The days stretched into weeks, and frustration weighed heavily on both detectives and the community. Every lead that failed to produce answers became a reminder of the cruel uncertainty surrounding Kathy Collins's fate. Becket and Davies worked tirelessly, their determination tempered by exhaustion, yet the absence of progress gnawed at them. Families whispered theories, neighbors worried openly, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Anger and despair coexisted, amplifying the sense that time was slipping away. Detroit's brightest hearts were now shadowed by doubt, and the unanswered questions pressed relentlessly, signaling the long, agonizing path toward a resolution that remained just out of reach. Even as the investigation pressed forward, the streets of Rosedale Park murmured with questions and half-truths. Neighbors who once exchanged casual greetings now watched one another with wary eyes, measuring the distance between civility and suspicion. Kathy Collins had been a familiar presence, her laughter and energy part of the neighborhood's rhythm, and her sudden absence left an unspoken void that everyone felt. Whispers carried from porch to porch. Some wondered if a stranger had somehow slipped into their midst, Others speculated whether someone close had used that trust to lure her away. Each theory, shared under the cover of hushed voices, sparked new fears and moral reckonings. The innocence of the community was tested, and people began to realize that even those who seemed ordinary could harbor secrets. Detective Becket noted how the subtle social dynamics influenced witness accounts. Family members' protective instincts sometimes obscured truth, while friends' fond memories occasionally blurred reality. Reggie Davies walked the same streets, listening intently, recording the minutiae of neighborhood interactions. Each whispered rumor was treated not as idle chatter but as a potential thread to follow. The emotional weight was not contained to the adults. Teenagers in the neighborhood speculated wildly, exchanging their own half-formed theories. Mothers fretted over the safety of their children. Fathers wrestled with guilt at not doing enough to protect them. Everyone was caught in a shared anxiety, a communal tension that underscored just how deeply Kathy's disappearance had penetrated daily life. The detective duo understood that these unspoken observations, these whispered stories, were as crucial as physical evidence. They painted a portrait of a neighborhood grappling with vulnerability, trust, and fear, all while the investigation quietly pressed onward, seeking to turn rumor into revelation. Detroit in 1960 was a city of contrasts. The bustling downtown, with its sleek department stores and thriving commerce, existed alongside neighborhoods where opportunity felt scarce and dreams were measured in careful increments. Kathy Collins, working at Hudson's, represented more than just ambition. She embodied the promise of upward mobility, a reminder that youth and talent could intersect with fortune. Yet, not everyone viewed that promise kindly. Whispers in the community began to carry undertones of envy and suspicion. Some questioned why Kathy seemed to move effortlessly through spaces others struggled to enter. Could ambition, charm, or even mere visibility paint a target on her back? The line between admiration and resentment blurred, leaving detectives to consider not only who had opportunity but also who might have been motivated by unspoken social pressures. Neighbors' stories reflected more than memory. They revealed subtle tensions. Remarks about family prestige, job prospects, and personal reputation all suggested a neighborhood finely attuned to social hierarchy. Becket and Davies understood that these pressures could distort relationships, cloud judgments, and conceal motives. Even those who outwardly mourned Kathy could have felt a conflicted mixture of respect, jealousy, or fear. In hushed conversations, some speculated about the people who might benefit from her disappearance, whether through attention, inheritance, or the removal of a perceived rival. The detectives had to navigate this complex social web, distinguishing between conjecture and genuine leads. Each revelation, each observation about human behavior, brought them closer to understanding not just the act itself, but the intricate network of desires, fears, and pressures surrounding Kathy's final hours. Detroit's streets and homes were alive with unspoken calculations, subtle judgments, and moral dilemmas. In these everyday interactions lay the faint clues of motive, waiting for investigators who could see beyond appearances into the hidden currents of human behavior. Weeks into the investigation, an unexpected letter arrived at the Detroit Police Department, typed, unsigned, and carrying a sense of urgency that immediately captured Detective Becket's attention. The writer claimed knowledge of Kathy Collins's disappearance, providing vague details about a possible location and hinting at someone within her social circle. The note was tantalizing yet frustratingly imprecise, leaving investigators to weigh its credibility against the reality of countless other tips that had led nowhere. The community reacted with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Gossip spread quickly, fueled by the sudden appearance of a potential lead. Some residents felt vindicated that attention had returned to the case, while others worried the tip might ignite false accusations, fracturing relationships that had already been strained by anxiety and fear. In cafes and living rooms, friends and neighbors debated who could possibly be implicated, their conversations tinged with both concern and suspicion. Becket and Officer Davies approached the letter cautiously. They knew the importance of following every lead, yet the emotional energy required to navigate anonymous claims was exhausting. Investigators combed through records, revisited witness statements, and retraced the timelines of individuals mentioned indirectly in the letter. Each action demanded meticulous attention, as even a small oversight could allow crucial information to slip through their grasp. The tip revealed one undeniable truth. The community's secrets were not dormant. People carried knowledge, connections, and suspicions that had not been voiced, and in the shadows of ordinary life, motives and opportunities often intersected in ways that were invisible to casual observers. The anonymous letter did not solve the case, but it reshaped the investigation, reminding both detectives and residents that the past was layered, and that hidden truths could emerge when least expected. As the weeks passed, unease settled like a weight over Rosedale Park. The anonymous tip had ignited not only investigative momentum, but also a ripple of suspicion that touched nearly every household. Friends questioned one another. Neighbors measured trust with new caution, and families wrestled with uncertainty about those they thought they knew. Fear was no longer abstract. It had become personal, pressing, and inescapable. Detective Becket observed the subtle shifts in the community. Casual exchanges became cautious. Greetings were measured. Conversations truncated. Even those with no direct connection to Kathy felt the tremor of anxiety, as though the disappearance had revealed a fragility they had never acknowledged. Every unaccounted glance, every whispered remark, became a potential lead or a reflection of communal fear. Speculation intensified. Some wondered if the perpetrator had been someone close to Kathy, someone whose outward normalcy masked troubling intentions. Others feared the dangers of outsiders, of strangers who could exploit trust. The detectives were forced to navigate both the emotional intensity of these suspicions and the practical necessity of separating meaningful evidence from rumor. The social pressure weighed heavily on individuals. Parents restricted their children's movements, friends hesitated to meet after dark, and longtime neighbors questioned each other's motives. Each day, the community's collective tension mounted, creating a climate where fear intertwined with moral judgment. These dynamics, though intangible, shaped the course of the investigation. In the shadow of uncertainty, Detective Davies reflected on a stark reality. Crime does not occur in isolation. It thrives where fear, mistrust, and secrecy converge. For Kathy Collins, these fears were now part of the story itself, echoing in every cautious glance and whispered suspicion, reinforcing the urgency of uncovering the truth before doubt and suspicion consumed the very community that had once seemed invincible. By now, the weight of uncertainty had settled firmly over the neighborhood. Each resident, in their own way, grappled with questions of judgment, trust, and the unknown motives that might have shaped that fateful December night. Families replayed past interactions, friends reconsidered overlooked details, and the community collectively reflected on what they could have done differently, if anything at all. Detective Becket recognized that understanding human behavior was as critical as any forensic clue. Fear, resentment, and hidden desires were threads woven into the social fabric, shaping actions that might seem ordinary on the surface yet carried consequences beyond comprehension. The investigation had revealed more than potential suspects. It exposed the fragility and complexity of human relationships under pressure. Amid the reflection, a gentle reminder emerges for us all. The choices we make, the trust we extend, and the awareness we maintain can ripple far beyond our immediate lives. Tell us, what would you have done in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. By engaging with the story, you honor not only Kathy Collins's memory, but also the community that carried her absence for decades, reminding us all of the human stakes at the heart of every cold case. In 1960, the tools available to investigators were rudimentary by today's standards. Detective Becket and Officer Davies understood that each lead, each scrap of evidence, could be lost forever without proper interpretation. Scientific methods were basic. Fingerprints, blood type, and eyewitness statements formed the backbone of investigative conclusions, leaving enormous gaps in understanding complex crimes. Every step required painstaking caution, yet the margin for error was high, and lives hung in the balance. When Kathy Collins's abandoned Ford Fairlane was discovered, The officers combed through the interior for clues. The pearl-buttoned glove lay untouched, a silent witness to the last moments she had been seen. Inside the trunk, Becket noticed a tiny, dark smear, a trace of biological material that might have offered answers decades later. At the time, it was labeled merely as type O blood, indistinguishable from the victim herself. The potential of the sample to reveal the perpetrator remained unrealized, constrained by the era's limitations. Even the most dedicated investigators felt the sting of helplessness. Hours were spent cross-referencing alibis, questioning friends and family, yet the evidence they possessed offered little beyond circumstantial connections. Each dead end carried an emotional weight, a sense of failing someone whose voice had been silenced too soon. Detective Becket, keenly aware of the stakes, recorded notes with care, insisting the sample be preserved. He sensed its future importance, though the means to exploit it simply did not exist. This small, overlooked fragment of truth became the silent promise of resolution, a hidden key waiting decades to unlock a mystery that had consumed the hearts and minds of all who cared for Kathy Collins. The disappearance of Kathy Collins had quickly become more than a personal tragedy. It was a public event, a story that gripped Detroit's consciousness. City officials, eager to maintain appearances, applied pressure on the Detroit Police Department to produce results swiftly. Newspapers printed daily updates, some with speculation bordering on accusation, while the community demanded reassurance. Every unanswered question reflected poorly on both law enforcement and city leadership. Detective Becket felt the weight of expectation pressing on him. Each interview had to balance thoroughness with expediency. Each follow-up had to be documented and justified. Mistakes carried consequences not only for the investigation but for the reputations of those tasked with solving it. Pressure mounted from all directions: supervisors urging results, families pleading for answers, and colleagues frustrated by the slow pace of tangible progress. Meanwhile, the public scrutiny created unintended distortions. Rumors that might have been dismissed in private were amplified, leading to false leads and misdirected suspicion. Innocent people felt the sting of accusation, while investigators struggled to separate genuine clues from noise. It was a delicate dance. Act too cautiously, and the case stagnates. Act too aggressively, and mistakes could ruin lives and careers alike. In the midst of this chaos, small but critical evidence risked being overlooked. Officer Davies and Becket knew that every minute misstep could delay justice for Kathy Collins and deepen the community's grief. They recorded every detail, aware that even minor errors might allow the perpetrator to remain free. The emotional cost was immense frustration, guilt, and a gnawing sense that despite their dedication, something crucial could slip through their fingers. The city's demand for swift answers collided painfully with the limitations of 1,960 seconds investigative science. And as the detectives labored under public expectation, one tiny clue, the one that could have altered everything, was already at risk of being misplaced, setting the stage for decades of silence. In the back of the Ford Fairlane's trunk, Detective Becket had discovered something small, almost inconsequential at first glance. A tiny smear of biological material. To any casual observer, it was nothing more than a dark stain on the lining. To Becket, however, it represented hope, the faintest thread connecting the mystery of Kathy Collins's disappearance to the person responsible. At the time, the science to analyze such a sample was limited. Testing could only determine blood type, a result that matched countless individuals, including the victim herself. Though the officers followed proper procedure, filing the sample and preserving it, the constraints of the era rendered the clue nearly useless. Every day that passed, without a breakthrough, amplified frustration, leaving the detectives with the painful realization that a single piece of evidence, capable of revealing the truth, could not yet fulfill its promise. As Becket catalogued the case file, he noted the importance of safeguarding the sample. A misplaced vial, lost in the shuffle of routine evidence storage or overwhelmed by bureaucratic oversight, could end any hope of solving the case. The fear was not abstract. It carried the weight of Kathy's absence, of a community still grieving, and of a justice system struggling to keep pace with human cruelty. Despite his vigilance, time and circumstance conspired against the sample. Amid the flurry of paperwork, shifting assignments, and citywide attention, the small vial was momentarily set aside, its potential value underestimated. That single, fragile piece of evidence, the linchpin of truth, was on the verge of vanishing into obscurity, unnoticed yet crucial. This moment, small and almost mundane in 1960, would echo across decades. The case teetered on the knife's edge between resolution and permanent silence, leaving detectives and loved ones alike suspended in an agonizing limbo, unaware that the tiniest misstep could delay justice for a lifetime. The misplacement of that tiny, critical vial reverberated far beyond the evidence room. For Detective Becket, every passing day without progress weighed heavily, a gnawing reminder of the life suspended in uncertainty. The absence of answers haunted the officers, eroding confidence and leaving them haunted by the thought that a simple oversight might have allowed a crime to remain unsolved for decades. For Kathy's family and Stanley Monroe, the delay was agonizing. Each day, without a lead, magnified grief, uncertainty, and frustration. Their world had been frozen on that December night, and the misinterpreted evidence ensured that the hope for closure remained just out of reach. Friends and neighbors, too, felt the sting of injustice, as whispers of missteps and mishandled clues spread through the community. This was a case defined not only by what had occurred, but by what had been lost in the process. The minutes, the hours, the opportunity for immediate answers. The emotional toll was immense. Guilt, helplessness, and lingering despair settled over all involved. Each misstep became a ghost, reminding detectives and loved ones alike that even the smallest lapse could stretch suffering across decades. Yet, even in this darkness, Becket's foresight preserving that fragile sample offered a faint glimmer of hope. It was the first promise that, one day, justice might finally arrive. As the investigation into Kathy Collins's disappearance continued, an undercurrent of fear took hold among those who might have provided insight. Neighbors whispered in cautious tones, reluctant to appear too curious or too involved. Friends of Kathy were subtly warned by well-meaning but nervous acquaintances. Questions could draw unwanted attention, and speaking openly might invite repercussions. Detective Becket and Officer Davies worked tirelessly to secure witness statements, yet the interviews often revealed more about fear than fact. Key observations were retracted, hesitated over, or softened under pressure. The once clear picture of Kathy's final hours became murky, obscured by doubt and apprehension. Every recanted detail was a tiny blow, each omission a painful reminder that truth can be as fragile as human courage. The city itself seemed to lean toward silence. Social norms in 1960 emphasized conformity, discretion, and the preservation of outward appearances. Families feared the stigma of association with a high-profile crime. For witnesses, the choice was stark. Protect themselves by remaining quiet, or risk social ostracism, suspicion, and even subtle retaliation. This tension created a shadow over the investigation, allowing opportunities for progress to slip through grasping hands. Amid this environment, frustration built in the detectives, who understood that the reluctance of witnesses was not born of malice, but of a community caught between grief, fear, and a desire to maintain control over their own lives. The truth of that December night became trapped, suspended in the anxiety of those too frightened to speak freely, leaving Kathy Collins's story incomplete and her loved ones trapped in agonizing uncertainty. For Stanley Monroe, Kathy's disappearance was more than a public mystery. It became a private torment. Each morning brought a hollow ache, a reminder that the woman he had planned to spend his life with had vanished without trace. Sleep offered no reprieve. Dreams were filled with fragmented images of her smiling face, abandoned gloves, and the empty passenger seat of her car. As the weeks turned to months, the weight of helplessness settled deeply into Stanley's bones. Friends and family urged him to move on, to accept that Kathy might never return. Yet the notion of letting go felt like betrayal, a surrender to the unknown forces that had stolen her. He walked the city streets as though tethered to a memory, observing places they had once frequented together. Each location now a silent witness to loss. Even the public attention, initially a source of hope, became a double-edged sword. Reporters arrived with cameras and questions, probing the raw wound of his grief. Stanley's every gesture was scrutinized, every interview dissected. The pressure to remain composed while privately unraveling added another layer of torment. Yet through it all, Stanley carried an unspoken resolve. He posted flyers, made calls, and spoke to anyone who might hold a fragment of information. Each act of persistence, though exhausting, was a lifeline, an assertion that Kathy's story would not fade quietly, that her absence demanded justice, and that he would endure the unending pain of uncertainty until the truth was revealed. Elaine Hayes, known to everyone as Laney, carried her own burden of grief. She had been the one waiting that December evening, nursing a soda and glancing at her watch, unaware that Kathy Collins would never arrive. The weight of what if haunted her. What if she had insisted more, called again, or followed her friend more aggressively? The questions gnawed at her, a relentless echo of helplessness and regret. Laney's anguish was compounded by the scrutiny of others. Colleagues and neighbors, though sympathetic, sometimes suggested subtle blame, as if her presence or absence on that night mattered. She felt trapped in a cage of memory, where every interaction and choice of that evening was endlessly replayed and dissected in her mind. Despite her pain, Laney refused to disappear from Kathy's story. She spoke to the press when asked, collaborated with detectives when possible, and quietly supported Stanley from the shadows. Her persistence was not about recognition. It was about keeping the memory of her friend alive, ensuring that Kathy was not forgotten amidst the growing void of silence. This duality, grief, and determination defined Laney's struggle. She moved through the world carrying both the sharp pang of loss and the steady flame of advocacy. Her courage, though often invisible to outsiders, anchored the investigation in ways the public could not see. Every day she endured, she bridged the gap between despair and hope, holding on to the possibility that, someday, answers might arrive, no matter how long it took. Across Detroit, a quiet tension settled over neighborhoods. People spoke in hushed tones, wary of drawing attention, wary of revealing what they might know. Fear of gossip, judgment, or subtle retaliation kept conversations shallow, smiles polite, and doors closed. The community, once vibrant and open, became cautious and guarded, trust frayed, as neighbors wondered what others had seen, heard, or withheld. This pervasive silence became its own kind of pressure, an invisible hand, restraining truth and amplifying grief. Kathy Collins's absence was felt not only in the lives of loved ones but in the hushed streets and wary glances of an entire city. Decades passed, and Kathy Collins's disappearance gradually slipped from the city's front-page news. The investigation, once urgent and frenzied, became a quiet file gathering dust in the Detroit Police Department's basement. The archival boxes, stacked high and unremarkable, held the remnants of a life interrupted. Typed reports, photographs of the abandoned Fairlane, and small personal effects. In this quiet darkness, the case seemed suspended in a frozen moment, untouched by time, yet profoundly affected by it. Detective Howard Becket, however, had anticipated the potential of future breakthroughs. Among the carefully catalogued items, one small vial stood out, a fragile trace of biological material discovered in the Ford Fairlane's trunk. On the front of the file, Becket had written a simple note, almost easily overlooked. Preserve. May be crucial. It was an unassuming piece of foresight, a single acknowledgement that science might one day catch up to circumstance. For those who handled the box in later years, the vial was just another item, fragile and inconsequential compared to the immediate pressures of active cases. Yet within that glass container lay a story yet untold, a dormant key that could reopen a decades-old wound and deliver answers long denied. The irony was stark. While the city moved on and memory faded, the evidence waited silently, steadfast in its potential, untouched by skepticism or bureaucracy. Every layer of dust, Every faded photograph became a reminder of what had been lost to time. But Becket's note was a promise embedded in paper. The case was not entirely abandoned, and the smallest fragment might one day change everything. That unassuming vial, nearly forgotten, would become the hinge upon which justice would eventually turn. As years turned into decades, the story of Kathy Collins receded from public attention. Newspapers that once carried her smiling photograph on front pages now relegated updates to brief, almost perfunctory mentions. Television segments faded, replaced by newer headlines, and radio broadcasts spoke of other events entirely. Detroit, vibrant and restless, had little room to dwell on a cold case that refused to yield answers. The community's focus shifted. Families once gripped by fear and curiosity gradually resumed their routines. The streets, once marked by anxious glances and whispered concerns, returned to their usual rhythm. Yet, even amid this return to normalcy, an undercurrent of unease persisted. Parents cautioned children more tightly, friends hesitated before taking risks, and neighbors carried unspoken memories of a young woman who had vanished without a trace. For those closest to Kathy, however, public forgetfulness offered no relief. Stanley Monroe's life remained suspended in grief, every unspoken question amplifying his isolation. Laney, too, felt the sting of a world eager to move on, while Kathy remained absent, unseen, and unheard. The contrast between collective amnesia and personal anguish highlighted the cruel disparity of time. Society could adapt and forget, but those who loved her could not. Even the detectives who had worked the case felt the weight of fading urgency. With the public no longer pressing for answers, institutional focus shifted to more immediate concerns, and funding for cold case investigations dwindled. Yet the small traces of evidence, tucked away in boxes and files, waited patiently. The city may have moved forward, but in the quiet recesses of the department, hope remained a fragile, persistent ember that one day might ignite. Years later, a new generation of detectives would inherit the Kathy Collins case, bringing fresh eyes and modern tools to a file long considered dormant. Victor Novak, a native Detroiter raised on the city's stories and legends, assumed responsibility with a mixture of reverence and urgency. For Novak, the case was not just an assignment, it was a personal mission, a challenge to uncover the truth that had eluded everyone else for decades. Novak pored over old photographs, witness statements, and the now yellowed reports, tracing the faint outlines of what had occurred that cold December evening. Every note, every forgotten detail, became a potential clue. But the most tantalizing piece was the vial that Becket had flagged so many years before. Novak recognized its significance immediately. Here lay a trace of truth, preserved despite time, bureaucracy, and general neglect, a fragment that could bridge the gap between decades of silence and the possibility of resolution. The detective understood that while technology had advanced beyond anything Becket could have imagined, the challenge would be equal to the promise. The vial, small and seemingly insignificant, held the potential to answer questions that had haunted families, neighbors, and the city itself. Novak's mind worked tirelessly, calculating every angle, envisioning every scenario that could transform a fragile biological sample into irrefutable evidence. Even as the city moved past the memory of Kathy Collins, Novak's determination ensured that the case remained alive in at least one corner of Detroit. The quiet hope that had lingered in the shadows was now nurtured with patience, skill, and modern science. That tiny vial, once boxed and forgotten, was poised to ignite a revelation that would pierce the decades of uncertainty and finally deliver the answers everyone had been waiting for. In 2021, decades after the Collins case had gone cold, Captain Victor Novak finally had the authority and resources to act. The once forgotten file, dusty and unremarkable on the shelf, suddenly gained new significance. Novak approached the Detroit Police Department's sub-basement with a mix of reverence and urgency, aware that what he held could finally pierce the silence that had endured for 61 years. At the heart of the case lay the Becket sample, a small vial of biological material, preserved carefully by Detective Howard Becket. Novak lifted it gently, feeling the weight of history in his hands. This was no ordinary sample. It was a fragment of truth, a remnant of a night that had haunted families, friends, and the city itself. Every precaution had to be observed. One misstep, one lapse in handling, and the fragile hope it contained could vanish entirely. Novak's team prepared for the delicate task ahead. He personally oversaw the transfer of the vial to the state's specialized crime lab, emphasizing strict chain of custody procedures. Every step, from refrigeration to transport, was documented with precision, a reflection of the lessons learned from decades of investigative frustration. As the sample moved closer to scientific scrutiny, Novak allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. He understood that while modern forensic technology could not rewrite history, it could illuminate it. The faint traces preserved in that tiny vial had the potential to connect the past with the present, to transform decades of unanswered questions into actionable leads. And as the lab technicians readied their equipment, Novak silently reminded himself and the city that this was more than a procedural reopening. It was a promise that Kathy Collins, absent and forgotten for far too long, might finally have her story completed, and justice could reach across 6 decades of silence. The Becket sample was more than glass and residue. It was a remnant of a night frozen in time, carrying the weight of unanswered questions. In the sterile, brightly lit lab, technicians approached it with cautious precision. Every movement was deliberate, gloved hands, antiseptic surfaces, and instruments calibrated to the smallest microns. One misstep could destroy the fragile traces that had survived decades. Captain Novak observed silently, understanding the stakes. This tiny vial could hold the first concrete answers the Collins case had seen since 1960. The air was thick with anticipation, an almost tangible tension that filled the space between the hum of equipment and the meticulous scribbles of lab notes. The sample, once forgotten in a dark basement, now commanded the full attention of a team of scientists trained to extract the impossible. The technicians carefully prepared the vial, ensuring that every particle would be preserved during extraction. Light passed through the small tube, illuminating the minute substance within, almost as if it held a secret waiting to be coaxed into revelation. Novak felt the gravity of the moment. A single, decades-old biological trace had the potential to rewrite the narrative, to provide a lead that generations of investigators had sought in vain. Time was a silent adversary. The sample's age made success uncertain. DNA degradation over 60 years was a formidable barrier, and every calculation, every precaution, was necessary to ensure nothing was lost. Yet, the faint hope within that tiny vial was enough to fuel determination. Novak knew that modern forensic science could succeed where past methods had faltered. The tiniest fragment of preserved material could illuminate an entire case, bridging the decades-long gap between disappearance and justice. In that quiet laboratory, hope had taken physical form, fragile yet undeniable, waiting for the first sign that the past might finally speak. The lab was a theater of precision. Technicians moved with choreographed focus, each step deliberate, every instrument carefully placed. Captain Novak watched as the vial of Beckett's sample was opened, the decades-old seal breaking with a soft, almost reverent snap. Inside, the remnants of a night-long past were fragile, barely visible, but within them lay the potential to answer questions that had haunted Detroit for generations. Pipettes hovered, and centrifuges hummed to life, spinning the sample in a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the case itself. Novak could feel the tension in the room. Each movement, each microscopic analysis, could either preserve the possibility of discovery or render it irretrievably lost. The scientists worked methodically, isolating cells, separating components, and running tests to determine the integrity of what little remained. Every step was punctuated by silent anticipation, punctuated only by the occasional soft click of lab equipment. Forensic DNA extraction was rarely cinematic, yet in this moment, it felt like a scene pulled from a thriller. Novak imagined detectives of the past, staring at empty streets and abandoned cars, unaware that a tiny sample had survived, waiting for this very process to unfold. The room was alive with potential, an invisible thread connecting the past to the present. Finally, after hours of careful handling, the first results appeared on the monitor. The DNA was faint, fragmented, partial but usable. Novak allowed himself a restrained nod, understanding the significance. This was the breakthrough that decades of inaction and technological limits had denied. The tiny Becket sample had survived, bridging a 61-year gap, and was now poised to reveal the identity of the person who had taken Kathy Collins from her life and from the city she loved. The first step toward justice had been taken. The question now lingered: who would the science point to? The partial DNA profile extracted from the Becket sample was uploaded to the National CODIS database with careful attention to detail. Captain Novak and his team held their breath, aware that decades of silence could be broken in moments or reinforced by disappointment. The screen blinked as the search ran, each passing second stretching the tension in the lab to an almost unbearable degree. When the results returned, the room fell silent. There was no match. No familiar name. No entry linking the decades-old crime to anyone in the system. The breakthrough they had hoped for, the definitive answer, had slipped through their fingers. Novak's heart sank, but he refused to let despair take hold. The result did not mean the end. It was a redirection, a signal that the path forward would demand patience, creativity, and the full use of modern investigative tools. Frustration mingled with resolve. The initial lack of a match reminded Novak how limited earlier investigations had been, and how easily a case could linger unresolved for decades. This dead end, while disheartening, only reinforced the importance of pursuing alternative methods. The forensic genetic genealogy approach, once considered experimental, now promised a route forward where CODIS had failed. Novak shared a glance with his team, unspoken determination passing between them. They would follow the thread of family connections, distant relatives, and generational clues. If the past could not be matched directly, it could be mapped, traced, and cornered with the meticulous application of science. The partial DNA had survived 61 years, and though CODIS offered no answer, it had delivered something equally vital: a renewed sense of possibility. Novak knew that the next steps, though complex and painstaking, could finally expose the person who had taken Kathy Collins from her life and left a city waiting for answers. With CODIS offering no answers, Captain Novak turned to a method that had only recently transformed cold case investigations: forensic genetic genealogy. The approach relied not on matching the DNA to known offenders, but on mapping connections across distant relatives, constructing a family tree that could point toward the person responsible. It was a painstaking process, blending cutting-edge science with patient detective work. Novak enlisted the expertise of Alma Dubois, a forensic genealogist renowned for her ability to translate genetic fragments into a living family map. Together, they pored over the DNA profile, analyzing segments, seeking the subtle markers that could connect the past to the present. Every shared strand of DNA was a potential clue, each connection a thread leading closer to the truth. Weeks became months, as the team built a genealogical puzzle spanning decades. They traced cousins, uncles, and long-forgotten branches of Detroit families. The process demanded precision, insight, and intuition, as a single misstep could send them down a false path. Novak monitored every development, aware that this new strategy offered the first real chance to unearth answers that had been locked away for over 60 years. As the tree took shape, tantalizing patterns began to emerge. One family line kept appearing with a frequency that could not be ignored, a line tied to Detroit's industrial workforce in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds. The realization sent a chill through the team. The person responsible had likely lived among neighbors, colleagues, and friends, unnoticed and unrecorded, for decades. Novak leaned forward, heart racing. The past had been silent for too long, but now it had left a trail, faint yet undeniable. The science, combined with patient investigation, had created a map pointing toward a single, living individual. The final question lingered. Who was he? And would the city be ready for the answer? Bernard Hawthorne's life appeared ordinary, almost invisible. To the residents of Dearborn, he was the model of quiet reliability. He watered his garden on weekends, exchanged polite greetings with neighbors, and attended Sunday services with unremarkable devotion. His presence was benign, so unassuming that few remembered his name until investigators began connecting dots decades later. Yet, as Captain Novak examined the genealogical leads, Bernard's name surfaced repeatedly, forcing a hard look at a man who had lived undisturbed for decades. Each connection, each distant relative, drew the investigation closer to someone who had carefully woven himself into the fabric of everyday life, hiding in plain sight. The thought was unsettling. A city's longest-standing cold case could now be pointing to a man considered harmless, a face the community trusted without question. Investigators approached cautiously, aware that the ordinary routine could conceal extraordinary darkness. Novak's team began discreet surveillance, noting routines, patterns, and interactions. Bernard's life seemed unchanged from the outside morning coffee at the corner diner, evening walks with his dog, occasional visits from family, but the shadow of suspicion began to stretch over the normalcy he had cultivated. The contrast between his quiet life and the decades-old disappearance of Kathy Collins created an invisible tension. How could someone so ordinary be linked to a crime that had haunted Detroit for more than 60 years? Novak understood that uncovering the truth would challenge assumptions, confront the community with unsettling realities, and ultimately reveal that evil can sometimes hide behind the most mundane of faces. The ordinary man in Dearborn had become a focal point, a living bridge between the past and the long-awaited justice that had remained out of reach for generations. The genealogical investigation began revealing patterns that could no longer be ignored. Alma Dubois traced shared DNA segments across distant relatives, constructing a sprawling family tree. Amid the labyrinth of cousins, uncles, and second cousins, one branch kept appearing with remarkable frequency. It was a line rooted in Detroit's industrial workforce of the 1,940 and 1,950, a family whose members lived quietly, never attracting attention or suspicion. Bernard Hawthorne's name repeatedly surfaced within this network, drawing investigators closer. At first, it was easy to dismiss an ordinary man, retired, living a peaceful life, but Novak and his team knew that genealogy did not lie. Each connection strengthened the probability that Bernard was the individual responsible for the decades-old disappearance. Small details began to line up: his age in 1960, his proximity to Kathy Collins' last known location, and subtle overlaps between his daily life and her social circles. The deeper the investigation delved, the more the team uncovered subtle, hidden connections. A minor acquaintance of Kathy's from high school, a cousin of Bernard's, had once attended a party she organized. Though trivial at first glance, this link suggested a plausible pretext for Bernard to initiate contact that December night enough to gain her trust, or at least her attention, without raising alarm. Each piece of information tightened the net around Bernard, turning a quiet man into a person of intense interest. Novak recognized that these revelations would shock the community, challenging the assumptions they held about their neighbors. The ordinary facade could not withstand scrutiny forever, and the genealogical puzzle had begun to reveal cracks in the mask Bernard had worn for decades. The investigation stood on a precipice. From distant DNA segments to tangible suspicion, the past and present were converging, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake the city's perception of trust, familiarity, and safety. With Bernard Hawthorne now the primary focus, Captain Novak's team initiated discreet surveillance. From unmarked vehicles to shadowed observation points near his bungalow, every movement, every routine was documented. Morning trips to the corner cafe, afternoons tending the lawn, and evenings walking his dog. All seemingly mundane actions were recorded with meticulous care, each one analyzed for the faintest hint of anomaly. To the casual observer, Bernard remained the same quiet, polite man the neighborhood had always known. Yet to the investigators, Each gesture and interaction became a thread in a tapestry of suspicion. They watched him converse with neighbors, noting expressions, pauses, and inconsistencies. Were these ordinary social exchanges, or subtle attempts to maintain a normal facade? Every glance over the shoulder, every slight hesitation in speech was catalogued, weighed, and cross-referenced with genealogical and historical findings. The tension was not limited to the investigators. The idea that a seemingly ordinary neighbor could be tied to a decades-old disappearance unsettled the team. The psychological weight of observing a man who may have hidden a horrific crime for more than 60 years pressed heavily on Novak and his colleagues. They were aware that uncovering the truth would inevitably shock the community, confronting residents with a reality they could scarcely imagine. Hours of observation yielded little concrete evidence, but patterns began to emerge. Bernard's daily rhythm, though outwardly ordinary, revealed the subtle predictability of human behavior. The team prepared to act carefully, knowing that even the smallest misstep could allow the man they suspected to detect their presence. As the surveillance continued, Novak understood that this quiet life, so carefully constructed over decades, was fragile. The investigation was now on the verge of revealing that beneath the calm exterior of this neighbor, history's long shadow had quietly been hiding in plain sight. As days of surveillance unfolded, small cracks began to appear in Bernard Hawthorne's carefully maintained facade. A hesitation here, a furtive glance there. Minor inconsistencies that would have been dismissed by casual observation became crucial clues under the watchful eyes of Captain Novak and his team. Each subtle irregularity heightened the tension. The ordinary man they had studied for weeks was no longer entirely predictable. Investigators noticed discrepancies between Bernard's recounted routines and the evidence gathered. Occasional unaccounted-for absences coincided with dates and locations linked to Kathy Collins' disappearance. While these gaps were minute, they created a psychological pressure that Bernard could not fully disguise. Novak understood the significance. A single misstep could expose decades of carefully hidden truths. Beyond the technicalities, there was a deeper shock looming. Bernard, a man trusted by his community, had lived an entire lifetime in plain sight. The idea that someone so familiar could be connected to a crime that haunted Detroit for more than 60 years unsettled everyone involved. The investigators felt the weight of responsibility not just to uncover the truth, but to manage the potential upheaval this revelation could cause within the neighborhood. Conversations with distant relatives revealed further hints. Small pieces of history Bernard had left unspoken, yet which now formed a pattern when combined with surveillance findings. Each detail seemed innocuous alone, but together they painted a chilling portrait. The ordinary exterior masking extraordinary darkness. By the end of this phase, Novak's team had begun to see the shape of the man behind the mask. Every gesture, every minor deception, and every unexplained action brought clarity to a picture that had been obscured for decades. The ordinary neighbor had begun to reveal the extraordinary truth lurking quietly beneath a life of apparent normalcy. As the investigation edged closer to Bernard Hawthorne, the potential ramifications began to weigh on Captain Novak and his team. The thought that a man so ordinary, so integrated into the community, could be linked to the decades-old disappearance of Kathy Collins sent ripples of unease through the city. It was not just about solving the cold case anymore, it was about confronting a truth that would challenge the trust of neighbors, friends, and families alike. Novak considered the broader implications. For 63 years, residents had lived with a comfortable assumption. The guilty party was long gone, the city's innocence intact. The revelation that someone so close had remained undetected for so long threatened to overturn that belief. Every observation, every genealogical match, and every subtle irregularity in Bernard's routine hinted at a reality few were prepared to face. The team braced for the moment when the truth would no longer remain confined to police files. They understood that the community would struggle to reconcile the man they knew, a polite neighbor, a churchgoer, a grandfather, with the crime that had haunted Detroit for generations. Novak felt a profound responsibility to ensure the findings were presented with care, acknowledging the shock and emotional impact while preserving the integrity of the investigation. Even in these final stages before action, Bernard remained outwardly calm, oblivious to the scrutiny he was under. Yet the tension among investigators was palpable. Each new piece of evidence, each confirmed genealogical link, brought them closer to confronting him, and, in turn, exposing the unsettling reality to the public. This section of the investigation set the stage for what would soon become a seismic revelation. A quiet, ordinary life was about to collide with a city's longest-running mystery. The tension, built over decades, was on the brink of eruption. After weeks of close observation, Bernard Hawthorne's patterns revealed a small, crucial window. He maintained a routine so consistent that even the most minor deviations became noticeable. On a crisp morning, as he left his bungalow for a brief walk to the corner cafe, he carried with him the unwitting key to solving a crime that had haunted Detroit for more than 6 decades. Captain Novak's team had prepared for this exact moment. Every detail was considered: the position of unmarked vehicles, the angle of surveillance, and the timing required to move without alerting Bernard to their presence. Every second mattered. One wrong move could shatter the delicate balance of secrecy and ruin a chance to finally obtain definitive evidence. As Bernard sat outside, sipping coffee and reading the morning paper, he discarded a used napkin into a nearby trash bin. To him, it was an ordinary action, a fragment of daily life. To the detectives, it was a golden opportunity. The napkin contained traces of DNA, unknowingly preserved in a fragile yet viable state. The final link between a decades-old cold case and the man who had hidden in plain sight for more than 60 years. The investigators held their breath, aware that what seemed simple could easily fail. Every precaution was necessary. Gloves, sterile collection tools, and strict chain of custody protocols ensured that no detail compromised the potential breakthrough. The emotional weight was almost tangible. After decades of waiting, a single discarded object could tip the scales of justice. For Captain Novak, it was a moment that combined strategy, patience, and fate. This mundane morning ritual had become a turning point. The quiet suburban street, once a symbol of ordinary life, now framed a historic opportunity, the first step in closing the longest-running chapter of Kathy Collins' story. The napkin, now lying in the trash bin, carried with it the weight of 63 years of unanswered questions. Captain Novak's team moved with deliberate care, aware that a single misstep could compromise the fragile link between evidence and truth. Each detective's hand was steady, gloves snug, as they lifted the paper with instruments designed to preserve even the tiniest fragment of DNA. There was a tense silence as the napkin was carefully placed into a sterile evidence bag, sealed, and labeled with meticulous attention to detail. Every step of the collection reinforced the gravity of the moment. This was not merely routine procedure. It was the culmination of decades of frustration, heartbreak, and unwavering dedication. Each officer involved felt the weight of the city's collective longing for answers pressing upon them. The team transported the sample under strict protocols to the state's forensic laboratory, ensuring that no contamination could occur during transit. The drive itself felt suspended in time. Traffic moved past obliviously, while the detectives carried the future resolution of a cold case that had haunted generations. Conversations were hushed, focused only on the steps required to preserve the integrity of the evidence. Inside the lab, scientists greeted the evidence with a mixture of awe and respect. Handling a paper fragment that could unlock a crime from 1960 demanded precision, skill, and patience. Each extraction tool, each chemical solution, was applied with the knowledge that the results would either confirm a breakthrough or send the team back into uncertainty. As the napkin was prepared for DNA testing, Novak felt a quiet, profound anticipation. For the first time in decades, the possibility of connecting Kathy Collins' disappearance to the man who had hidden in plain sight felt within reach. A single, discarded napkin, the most ordinary of objects, was about to carry extraordinary consequences. Inside the forensic laboratory, the tension was almost tangible. The napkin, fragile and unassuming, was now the vessel of truth. Technicians approached the task with steady hands, aware that the decades-long silence surrounding Kathy Collins's disappearance hung on the outcome. Every step of the extraction process was executed with surgical precision, each moment charged with anticipation. DNA extraction from evidence this old was a delicate procedure. The team carefully isolated cellular material, navigating the degradation caused by decades of time. Each microscopic fragment offered a chance to connect a face to a crime that had long haunted Detroit. As chemical solutions and specialized equipment worked to reveal what lay hidden, the room was hushed, save for the quiet hum of machines. Every beep and click seemed to mark the heartbeat of a city holding its breath. Captain Novak watched the process closely, fully aware of the stakes. This was more than science, it was the culmination of decades of dedication, frustration, and hope. For over 60 years, the community had wondered, feared, and mourned. Now, the possibility of clarity, of justice finally arriving, was within reach. When the preliminary results appeared on the lab monitor, the room shifted. Technicians exchanged quiet nods. The DNA on the napkin had survived, intact enough to be analyzed. The profile was partial but promising, a thread strong enough to follow. Novak allowed himself a brief, cautious optimism. This was the key to unlocking a chain of events that had remained suspended for generations. And yet, even with progress in hand, uncertainty lingered. Could this fragile, long-forgotten evidence definitively link Bernard Hawthorne to the night Kathy vanished? The city's longest-running mystery was teetering on the edge of resolution, and every second that ticked by brought the investigation closer to its most decisive moment. The phone call from the laboratory arrived quietly, yet its impact was immediate and seismic. The DNA extracted from the discarded napkin matched the profile from the Becket sample, an undeniable link across more than 6 decades. Bernard Hawthorne, the unassuming neighbor who had lived an ordinary life, was finally connected to the crime that had haunted Detroit since December 3, 1960. Captain Novak absorbed the weight of the confirmation. The statistical certainty left no room for doubt. The partial profile had proven enough. The long chain of meticulous collection, surveillance, and forensic expertise, culminating in this single, irrefutable moment. The decades of silence, speculation, and anguish were now pierced by clarity. The emotional impact on the investigation team was profound. Relief, tension, and a flicker of triumph intertwined. This was the moment they had trained for, the purpose behind the countless hours spent reviewing cold files, tracing genealogical leads, and preserving fragile evidence. Every setback, every ignored lead from the past, had led to this turning point. For the city, though, the truth was still hidden behind legal procedures and controlled announcements. The detectives had to act methodically. Arrest warrants, evidence verification, and coordinated planning would follow. Yet the human element, the team's shared sense of vindication and justice was immediate. A crime that had remained unsolved for over 60 years now had a face, a name, and a path to accountability. In reflecting on the breakthrough, Captain Novak paused to consider the moral weight of the moment. Bernard Hawthorne's decades of ordinary life could not erase the violent choice of his youth. And the community, long haunted by uncertainty, was on the verge of learning a truth that would shatter assumptions and stir deep emotional reactions. Subscribe, be first to learn justice found after decades. Novak reminded the team, a subtle acknowledgement that the city and the world were watching, awaiting the revelation of long overdue answers. With the DNA match confirmed, the focus shifted from evidence to understanding why. Bernard Hawthorne had remained a quiet presence in his community for decades. A neighbor, a grandfather, a man of seemingly ordinary habits. The detectives now faced the unsettling task of reconstructing a life that concealed a violent act. Investigators delved into Hawthorne's past, uncovering a faint connection to Kathy Collins. A cousin of his had once attended a party with her, an acquaintance that provided a plausible pretext for contact. It was the kind of minor, forgotten social link that could easily have been overlooked by the initial investigation. Yet it offered a chilling insight. This was not a random act, but a calculated choice, exploiting trust and familiarity. The team pieced together the night of December 3rd, 1960, through witness statements, timelines, and logical deduction. Hawthorne's opportunity arose during Kathy's planned outing with Lainey Hayes. He intercepted her, using either the pretext of an emergency or a casual approach designed to gain her compliance. The seemingly mundane gestures, a knock on the car window, a word of reassurance, masked a moment that would irrevocably alter the lives of everyone involved. Detectives also considered the social pressures and behavioral patterns of the era. Young women navigating urban spaces were expected to trust and comply with certain social norms. Hawthorne exploited that societal expectation, and in doing so, left behind minimal physical evidence, a fact that allowed him to evade capture for more than 6 decades. As the motive emerged, the room fell silent with the weight of realization. This was a crime born of opportunity, control, and disregard for human life. And yet, the confession had not yet been secured. The narrative remained incomplete, poised at the brink of revelation, with the full scope of guilt ready to be revealed. "Tell us, what would you have done in her shoes?" Novak whispered to the team, knowing this question echoed the moral dilemma facing every viewer. With Bernard Hawthorne firmly linked to the crime, the next step was both procedural and tense. Securing the arrest warrant. Every detail mattered, every document scrutinized. The detectives understood that one misstep could allow decades of justice to slip away once more. Captain Novak convened his team, laying out the evidence systematically. The DNA match, corroborated by the forensic genealogical work, provided a concrete foundation. The investigation file, which had survived over 60 years, now served as a roadmap for imminent action. Each prior lead, once disregarded or overlooked, became part of the legal architecture that would bring Hawthorne into custody. There was a palpable gravity in the room, though unspoken. The officers were aware that this man, who had led an outwardly ordinary life, carried a past that could no longer hide. The weight of responsibility pressed down every procedural step. Every signature required was a safeguard against the possibility of a legal reversal or public skepticism. The warrant itself was a culmination of decades of diligence. Clear statements, verified dates, and the explicit linkage of Hawthorne to both the Becket sample and the DNA collected from the napkin. Legal teams reviewed phrasing, ensuring the document was airtight. Novak double-checked chain of custody documentation, forensic notes, and genealogy reports. Even a minor inconsistency could jeopardize the decades-long pursuit of justice. As the final signatures were obtained, the sense of anticipation was electric. The city's longest-running mystery was poised to reach its decisive moment. For Novak and his team, there was a quiet acknowledgement. Justice was imminent, and yet the emotional gravity of arresting an 83-year-old man whose neighbors had long seen him as benign added a complicated layer to the victory. The warrant completed, the next step loomed. Executing the arrest, confronting Hawthorne, and finally unraveling the full story of Kathy Collins' disappearance. The suspense was now at its peak. The quiet morning in Dearborn was abruptly pierced by the arrival of Detroit detectives. Bernard Hawthorne, sitting at his kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, greeted the officers with an unsettling calm. There was no panic, no resistance, only the measured composure of a man who had anticipated this moment for decades. Captain Novak presented the arrest warrant, his voice steady but heavy, with the weight of 63 years of unanswered questions. Hawthorne's gaze remained distant, almost clinical. "I knew this day would come," he admitted quietly, acknowledging the inevitability of justice finally catching up. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every officer present felt the gravity of the moment. Handcuffs clicked against his wrists, a sound that echoed far beyond the modest kitchen. Hawthorne was guided from his home, each step a silent reminder of the life he had led in plain sight, while carrying the burden of a hidden crime. Neighbors peered cautiously from behind curtains, struggling to reconcile the friendly, ordinary man they knew with the subject of Detroit's most infamous cold case. Outside, news crews were already positioning cameras, sensing the extraordinary nature of this arrest. A lifetime of anonymity had ended with the quiet clang of handcuffs and the measured footsteps of a man led into custody. Detroit, and eventually the nation, would soon confront the shocking truth. Someone who appeared ordinary could have concealed such a darkness for decades. For Captain Novak and his team, the arrest was both a professional triumph and an emotional reckoning. The decades-long pursuit of justice had finally yielded its moment, and the public was about to witness a story of crime, patience, and the relentless passage of time reaching its final act. Word of Bernard Hawthorne's arrest spread through Dearborn and Detroit like wildfire. Neighbors, co-workers, and longtime acquaintances struggled to comprehend the news. The man who had mowed lawns, volunteered at his church, and smiled politely at the grocery store for decades was now revealed as the perpetrator behind one of the city's most haunting cold cases. At community centers and local diners, hushed conversations turned to disbelief, anger, and fear. How could we have known? People asked one another, shaking their heads in frustration. Many felt a sense of betrayal, questioning every interaction they had shared with Hawthorne over the years. The contrast between his ordinary, unremarkable life and the horrific crime from 1960 left the community grappling with a deep, unsettling shock. Social circles that had once viewed him as harmless now whispered, piecing together moments that, in hindsight, seemed suspicious. Friends recounted minor oddities, meaningless at the time, now reframed under the lens of revelation. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. Ordinary life and extraordinary evil collided in the minds of those who had known him. For Detroit, the arrest was a chilling reminder that evil does not always wear a recognizable face. Parents questioned what other hidden dangers might exist in plain sight. The elderly felt unease in familiar streets. Even casual acquaintances, once confident in their judgment, were forced to reconsider the reliability of appearances. The collective shock rippled across the city. Conversations that had long ignored the 1960 disappearance of Kathy Collins resurfaced. Community members debated morality, trust, and the unsettling fact that justice, no matter how delayed, can eventually arrive in the most unexpected forms. The story of Kathy Collins, dormant in newspapers and memory for decades, erupted once again as cameras and microphones descended on Detroit. Headlines splashed across front pages and digital feeds. Michigan cold case solved after 63 years. The Hudson's Girl. Justice comes late. The media, long absent from the Collins case, returned with renewed intensity, eager to document the astonishing resolution. Reporters scoured every corner of the city, interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone who had once crossed paths with Bernard Hawthorne. Their cameras captured reactions of disbelief, grief, and anger. People who had followed the case in whispers for years now spoke openly, recounting the long shadow Kathy's disappearance had cast over the community. Television news segments juxtaposed photographs of a vibrant 26-year-old Kathy against images of Hawthorne's ordinary suburban life. The contrast was striking. One life stolen, another lived quietly, hiding its past. The narrative gripped viewers, blending the nostalgia of 1960 Detroit with the undeniable weight of long-awaited justice. Even journalists who had first covered the disappearance found themselves reliving emotions once thought buried. For the public, the flood of media attention served as a collective reckoning, reminding the city of the pain endured by Stanley Monroe, Kathy's family, and countless others who had longed for answers. As the coverage intensified, questions emerged across letters to editors and online forums. How could someone remain undetected for so long? How did the justice system catch up after 6 decades? Viewers engaged deeply, reflecting on morality, patience, and the power of persistence. The return of the media ensured that Kathy Collins's story, once nearly forgotten, would claim the spotlight. The city, now confronting both the tragedy and the resolution, was reminded that even the quietest lives can conceal extraordinary truths, and that time, no matter how long, cannot erase the call for justice. The news of Bernard Hawthorne's arrest reached Stanley Monroe in Arizona, where he had spent decades in quiet mourning. The weight of grief that had anchored his life for more than 60 years shifted suddenly, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and disbelief pressing on him at once. Stanley's hands trembled as he heard the details: the DNA match, the confession, and finally, the location of Kathy's remains. For the family, emotions erupted in a torrent long restrained. Tears flowed freely, each one a testament to the decades of unanswered questions and imagined scenarios that haunted them nightly. Kathy's parents, now elderly, finally received the confirmation that had eluded them for more than half a century. The chance to honor her memory, to lay her to rest properly, brought both devastation and solace. Stanley's closure, though bittersweet, was intensely personal. The love he had held in suspended animation for so many years could finally find an outlet in mourning, remembrance, and the rituals of goodbye. Every photograph, every story he told of Kathy, now carried the weight of confirmed truth. There were no lingering doubts, no hypothetical scenarios, just the stark, tangible reality of justice served. The emotional resonance of the arrest reached beyond family walls. Friends and community members who had watched Stanley's life entwined with Kathy's memory felt a shared release, a collective exhalation after years of tension. The decades of speculation, frustration, and anguish were met with a hard-earned reckoning that provided emotional closure to a case that had once felt impossibly open-ended. Even in grief, there was gratitude. Gratitude for the detectives who had refused to let time erase the case, and for the forensic science that finally spoke when all else had failed. For Stanley and his family, the painful journey that began on December 3rd, 1960, was finally reaching a close, leaving them to navigate a new chapter shaped by loss, remembrance, and a long-awaited sense of justice. Decades can feel endless when answers are withheld. For 63 years, the people of Detroit carried a quiet, gnawing uncertainty, the question of what truly happened to Kathy Collins. The unresolved pain lingered in neighborhoods, in the hearts of friends, and most intensely, in the life of Stanley Monroe. How does a community endure when the truth is locked away, unseen, and unspoken? And what of the individuals who wait, hoping for closure that never seems to arrive? The eventual resolution of this case forces reflection. Justice, though postponed by time, bureaucracy, and circumstance, was not denied. The long silence of 63 years amplifies the magnitude of truth when it finally surfaces. The arrest of Bernard Hawthorne and the recovery of Kathy's remains demonstrate that even in cases where decades pass, the pursuit of justice remains relentless. There is a moral lesson here. Persistence, combined with evolving technology and tireless dedication, can overcome the constraints of history. For the public, the story challenges notions of finality. We often assume that age and delay erode the possibility of accountability. Yet Kathy Collins' case proves the opposite. It is a testament to human determination and the belief that wrongs, no matter how long hidden, can be confronted. And still, questions remain, prompting viewers to ponder their own role in vigilance and empathy. Could earlier attention have changed the trajectory of events? How do we, as a society, balance patience with urgency when lives hang in the balance? These reflections underscore the weight of responsibility that accompanies both action and inaction. In Kathy's story, justice was delayed, but not denied, and that truth serves as a beacon, illuminating the value of persistence, moral courage, and the unwavering belief that some wrongs, however long buried, will eventually be exposed. Detective Howard Becket and Captain Vic Novak are more than names in a case file. They are symbols of unwavering commitment. Becket, who first stepped into the mystery of Kathy Collins in 1960, recognized the significance of even the smallest details. His foresight, preserved in that tiny vial of biological material, was a silent promise to the city and to Kathy herself, that no lead, however seemingly insignificant, would be dismissed. Decades later, Novak carried that torch with a determination shaped by modern capabilities. Where Becket had faced the limits of mid-century forensics, Novak navigated the era of DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. His patience, his insistence on revisiting the old evidence, and his ability to merge traditional detective work with cutting-edge science proved pivotal. Without this dual dedication spanning generations, the case may have remained an eternal mystery. Their work illustrates a profound truth. Justice is often less about spectacle and more about perseverance. It is the quiet hours spent reviewing reports, the repeated petitions for funding, and the meticulous care of fragile evidence that ultimately yield results. Becket's note, Novak's advocacy, and the seamless handoff between eras exemplify the human spirit's capacity to bridge time in pursuit of truth. This story reminds us that heroes do not always wear badges of fame. Sometimes, they are the ones who refuse to let history forget, who treat forgotten evidence as sacred, and who understand that justice, no matter how delayed, is worth every effort. Their legacy transcends a single solved case. It serves as a blueprint for investigators everywhere. The dedication of Becket and Novak shows that a relentless pursuit of truth, tempered with patience and ingenuity, can pierce through decades of silence and bring the forgotten into the light. The story of Kathy Collins extends far beyond the confines of Detroit or a single cold case. It holds lessons for every community, every family, and every individual. At its core, it challenges us to consider the consequences of inaction, the weight of overlooked details, and the moral responsibility we carry toward one another. How often do we witness injustice and turn away, assuming someone else will act? Kathy's decades-long absence reminds us that silence can allow wrongdoing to persist, and that vigilance is not optional, it is essential. Socially, the case underscores the fragile balance between trust and caution. Communities are shaped by shared norms and assumptions, but those same assumptions can blind us to danger. Bernard Hawthorne lived as a neighbor, a grandfather, a seemingly ordinary man, yet his actions in 1960 remind us that appearances can deceive, and that accountability may come decades after the moment of violation. This is also a story about hope and the value of persistence. Families, investigators, and even the public who followed Kathy's disappearance kept her memory alive. It demonstrates that maintaining focus, even when systems falter or attention fades, can create the conditions for eventual justice. For viewers, there is a personal takeaway. Vigilance, empathy, and moral courage are responsibilities we all share. Speak up when something seems wrong. Protect the vulnerable. Never underestimate the impact of perseverance, whether in pursuit of truth or in defense of others. And as we reflect, consider your own role. Could a small action today prevent decades of suffering tomorrow? Comment below, how would you have acted if faced with the choices and uncertainty surrounding Kathy Collins? Your engagement is more than participation. It is a continuation of the vigilance that finally brought justice to her story. Kathy's journey from disappearance to resolution reminds us, justice, memory, and responsibility are intertwined, and society's lessons are written in the lives it fails and protects. After more than 6 decades, the silence that had gripped Detroit finally broke. Kathy Collins' story, frozen in time since that cold December night of 1960, reached its long-awaited conclusion. The tireless work of Captain Vic Novak, the dedication of Detective Howard Becket decades before, and the painstaking breakthroughs in forensic science had brought an end to the agony. For Stanley Monroe, who had lived in the shadow of grief for over 60 years, this resolution was both shattering and relieving. The news of Kathy's recovery, the confession of Bernard Hawthorne, and the closure offered by her proper burial allowed the family to release the decades of anguish they had carried. The community, too, experienced a wave of disbelief mixed with vindication. A neighbor, a quiet man who seemed ordinary in every way, was revealed to be the culprit. Detroit, long haunted by unanswered questions, could finally reconcile the horror of what happened with the relief of justice delivered. It was a reminder that even the longest shadows can be illuminated, that truth, no matter how delayed, can ultimately prevail. And for those following the story from across the world, the lesson resonates. Persistence matters. Those who never gave up, from family members to detectives, ensured that Kathy's voice, silenced for decades, was finally heard. Before we continue reflecting on the broader lessons, a quick note to our viewers. Subscribe now, don't miss when the next long-buried truth is found. Staying connected means you witness justice as it unfolds, and you become part of the community that refuses to let stories like Kathy's fade into obscurity. The emotional weight of decades of unanswered questions now begins to lift. But the story still carries wisdom for every viewer, reminding us that time cannot erase truth, and patience combined with action can bring justice even after generations. Kathy Collins' case reminds us that justice is not always immediate, and the passage of time does not lessen its importance. For decades, the streets of Detroit whispered questions with no answers, leaving families and communities suspended in uncertainty. Yet, the persistence of those who refused to forget Detective Howard Becket's foresight, Captain Vic Novak's dedication, and the quiet determination of Stanley Monroe demonstrates that even the most frozen cases can thaw when diligence meets innovation. This story also poses difficult questions about human nature. How can someone live a lifetime seemingly ordinary while hiding a crime that shaped countless lives? How does a community cope with the revelation that darkness can wear a familiar face? These questions linger long after the details of the arrest are known, inviting each of us to consider accountability, vigilance, and empathy. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Curiosity and attention matter. The tools available to investigators today, genetic genealogy, modern forensics, and persistent record-keeping, were unimaginable in 1960. But the combination of human intuition and scientific advancement can bridge decades of silence. Every small action, every note, every careful preservation of evidence contributed to unearthing the truth. As we reflect on these lessons, think about the impact of choices left unexamined, of questions left unasked. The moral line is not only about condemning the guilty but about understanding our own responsibility to remain aware, engaged, and compassionate. This moment also calls for your thoughts. Tell us, what would you have done in her shoes? Share your reflections in the comments, and join the conversation about justice, memory, and the consequences of actions left unresolved. As Kathy Collins' story closes, the broader implications for viewers become clear. This case teaches patience, vigilance, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. It reminds us that no matter how much time passes, evidence preserved, questions asked, and actions taken with care can bring justice even decades later. It is a call to pay attention, to value persistence, and to honor the memory of those whose voices were silenced too soon. For our audience, this story is not just about a crime solved, it's a mirror reflecting the importance of awareness in our own communities. How many unanswered questions linger around us, dismissed or overlooked? Kathy's case shows that resolution often requires courage, collaboration, and innovative thinking. It is a testament to the detectives, families, and scientists who refuse to let time erase accountability. To remain part of this journey, and to witness more stories where truth triumphs against incredible odds, subscribe now. Don't miss when the next long-buried truth is found. Subscribing ensures you stay informed, connected, and part of a community that values justice and empathy. Finally, engage with us. Comment which clue shocked you most, then watch our cold case playlist. Sharing your thoughts not only enriches the discussion but strengthens the collective awareness that helps prevent such tragedies from being forgotten. As this chapter ends, remember Kathy Collins and the lessons her story carries. Justice may be delayed, but the power of human determination, careful preservation of evidence, and the pursuit of truth cannot be denied. Each case, each clue, and each voice matters, and your attention ensures that stories like Kathy's are never truly lost.